handing you the binders with the exhibits we'll be going through today.
If you'll please remain standing, place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you, sir.
All right, it's Mr. Sella, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, sir, Mr. Sella. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cooper, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you state your full name for the court?
Sure. Christopher Allen Cooper.
Just to be clear, you are not related to the governor.
I am not.
Okay. Where are you presently employed?
Western Carolina University.
Where is Western Carolina University located?
It's in Western North Carolina, as the name would suggest, so it's in Cullowhee, North Carolina.
And do you live near Western Carolina University?
I do.
And where is that?
Silva, North Carolina,
How long have you lived in Silva?
since 2002.
And before that, where did you reside?
Was born just over the border in South Carolina. I've also lived in Virginia, and I've also lived in Tennessee.
You mentioned that you work at Western Carolina University. What positions do you hold there?
So I'm the Robert Lee Madison Distinguished Professor and Department Head in the Department of Political Science and Public Affairs.
Before you started there, what was your educational background?
So I got an undergraduate degree, again, just over the border in South Carolina at Winthrop University in political science and sociology. I have a master's and a PhD from the University of Tennessee.
So you said you're a professor and a department head there at Western Carolina University. How long have you been a department head there?
Been a department head, I think this is my 8th year. The first year I was interim, so either 7 or 8, depending on how you count.
Okay. And what classes do you teach there as a political science professor and department head?
I teach a variety of classes. Probably most frequently I teach state and local government to our undergraduate students. I also teach a graduate level course of that called state and local governance. And both, I'm sorry.
Undergraduate.
I'm sorry.
State local government for undergraduate students
And a class called state and local governance to our graduate students. Both have a focus on North Carolina. We don't have a separate North Carolina politics class, so we incorporate that. Also teach parties, campaigns, and elections frequently. I teach Southern politics. I teach undergraduate research methods. I teach graduate research methods, and policy analysis from time to time.
And outside of the classroom, have you taught your students about state politics in North Carolina?
Yeah, as much as I can.
And how so?
So obviously take students to Raleigh as much as we can to meet with members of the General Assembly, both Republican and Democratic, visit local think tanks. We host debates most election seasons on campus, featuring folks running for our local General Assembly seats. Bring in guest speakers as much as possible onto campus, both in Cullowhee and in our graduate satellite campus in Asheville, so our students can hear directly from state lawmakers and other folks involved in North Carolina politics.
Have you been recognized for your teaching or your academic research?
I have. So I've received Western Carolina University's highest awards in both research and teaching. So I won the University Scholar Award. I was also won the Board of Governors Teaching Award. So each one of the 16 UNC institutions has one winner of that per year, and I won that. And I was also named North Carolina Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. I won the Best Paper Award from the North Carolina Political Science Association.
You mentioned that you won the Board of Governors Award. Were you recognized in any other way for that?
Yeah, I was fortunate actually. Our local member of Congress, Mark Meadows, entered my name in the congressional record, congratulating me for winning that award.
We talked a little bit about your teaching at Western Carolina University. Do you hold any other administrative positions there, or have you held any administrative positions there?
Sure. So right now, as I mentioned, I'm department head, and I've been department head for the last 7 or 8 years, depending on how you count the interim. And I've also been the director of our Master of Public Affairs program, our MPA program, which is located in Asheville. And I was also director of the Public Policy Institute for a number of years. So that's a nonpartisan kind of applied outreach, applied research and outreach, almost like a little think tank within the university for a number of years.
Dr. Cooper, where have you focused your academic research?
So most of my work is in state and local politics, particularly in North Carolina when possible. I also do some work in Southern politics and I've done a little bit of work in public administration as well, again, at the state and local levels.
Have you published in these areas?
I have.
And how often?
So I published just shy of 50 refereed journal articles, another half dozen or so book chapters. In 2008, I co-edited a book called The New Politics of North Carolina that was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and I co-authored 2 of those chapters and authored one of those chapters in that edited volume. I also published a book last year with the University of North Carolina Press.
And I know you mentioned you had a couple of book chapters in these topics as well. Could you talk about those?
Sure. So I think the ones most relevant here, I've got 2 chapters and 2 editions of a book called, I think it's called Swing State Politics, but essentially it's a compilation of various swing states, North Carolina being one of them. I co-authored that chapter in 2 editions of that book.
So could we take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 254 on the screen, please? And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here in Exhibit 254?
That's my CV as of April 2019.
And is it accurate?
As of April 2019.
Okay. Is there anything you wanted to update since that date?
So the distinguished professorship I received starting July 1st, so that was not reflected on the CV.
Other than that, it's accurate?
Yes.
Great. You can take Exhibit 254 off the screen. Dr. Cooper, are you familiar with redistricting?
I am.
And how so?
So, as anybody interested in who studies state politics in this state or any other state would be, I'm obviously familiar with the way district lines are drawn. It undergirds a lot of my analysis of state politics in general. I also teach about redistricting, and I've spoken to the press about redistricting. I've also spoken to a variety of community and professional groups about redistricting.
Are you familiar with gerrymandering?
I am.
And what is your understanding of what that term gerrymandering means?
When one party draws district lines to benefit themselves at the expense of the other.
Dr. Cooper, have you worked with maps in your academic research?
I have.
And how so?
So, again, I think to understand state politics, to understand voters and how voters are represented, you've got to have some understanding of maps. So, certainly I use maps in my teaching. I create maps to illustrate concepts to students. So, for example, I might create a map for a class that would have, states that have a certain policy versus states that don't have a certain policy, or states that, various levels of poverty represented on a map. I've also used maps in my scholarship as well and in public presentations.
Are you familiar with mapping software?
I am.
And how so?
So I audited a class a few years ago at Western Carolina University that primarily used ArcGIS, and so I tried to make sure I understood that program better. I also have used the mapping. There's a mapping part of a software called Stata, and so I've used that, and that's what I've made most of my maps in.
Dr. Cooper, have you testified as an expert before?
I have not.
Have you been recognized in any other ways professionally, or there have been other ways where others have relied on your expertise?
So I talked to the press a fair bit about North Carolina politics, both nationally and in our state. So I've talked to reporters over the years from the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Public Radio, also National Public Radio affiliates at WNC, as well as in Charlotte and in Asheville. Talked to the News and Observer here in Raleigh. I've talked to the Charlotte Observer, Asheville Citizen Times, of course. So a variety of media about North Carolina politics.
And have you participated in any academic conferences that concern state politics here in North Carolina?
I have. So I've off and on gone to the North Carolina Political Science Association. I've been parts of panels on North Carolina politics there. A number of years ago, there's this conference called the Citadel Symposium on Southern Politics, which is not surprisingly located at the Citadel. And so we organized a panel around North Carolina politics. It was centered around our edited book.
Dr. Cooper, why did you agree to testify in this case today?
2 reasons. Really, one is I think it's a good opportunity to apply my expertise to a real-world issue in state politics, and so it's one thing I'm passionate about. The other is I think it helps me sort of address a puzzle that I've been interested in for a long time, which is it sort of seems like our General Assembly is out of step in a lot of ways from other elected offices in North Carolina, and I wanted to investigate that further, determine if that was true, and if so, to what degree gerrymandering was responsible.
Dr. Cooper, what is your understanding of the purpose of these proceedings?
So my understanding is that the plaintiffs, so North Carolina Common Cause, the North Carolina Democratic Party, and a series of voters are alleging that the current General Assembly boundaries are gerrymandered, quite simply, and that they dilute their voting power.
What questions have you been asked to address as part of your work in this case?
So I think about the questions in sort of three buckets. So first is to conduct really the statewide analysis. So at the outset I said I was interested in the degree to which North Carolina is out of step or not. And so I wanted to look at various measures of public opinion in our state. I wanted to look at electoral outcomes in the General Assembly. Also wanted to look at electoral outcomes concerning statewide offices. Compare those within North Carolina as well as compare North Carolina to other states to figure out where do we fit. The second part of the analysis was to examine the individual county clusters, and so I know we've heard for the last 2.5 days a lot about clusters, and so I wanted to look at each one of those clusters, examine the contours of those lines, examine the voting patterns, and also kind of overlay those over my knowledge of these places and their political histories. And the third part was to examine a set of files from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive, the primary map maker, and look to see to what degree he had partisanship available to him, to what degree he considered partisanship, to what degree he used partisanship in drawing these lines.
So we're going to go into depth in those three areas that you just mentioned, but did you file any expert reports in this case?
I did.
Could we put up Plaintiff's Exhibit 253 on the screen?
Yes. I'll be happy to. Sorry.
And Dr. Cooper, do you recognize what Plaintiff's Exhibit 253 is?
I do.
And is that your expert report from April of this year?
It is.
Could you put up Plaintiff's Exhibit 329 on the screen? And Dr. Cooper, do you recognize what Plaintiff's Exhibit 329 is?
I do.
And what is that?
This is my second expert report.
Okay. You can take Exhibit 329 down. So you talked a moment ago about the questions that you addressed, and I'd like to ask you a little bit about how you went about addressing those questions. You mentioned that the first set of issues you looked at was the General Assembly and whether or not it was out of step with statewide voting in North Carolina and the North Carolina citizenry. How did you go about looking at that question?
So sort of, I guess at the most basic level, I tried to find every piece of data I could to help me address that question, right? So sometimes those were measures that political scientists have developed that measure statewide public opinion or other statewide measures so I can compare our state to others. I also collected election return data. I also, so the election return data so I could compare the General Assembly to offices that can't be subject to gerrymandering. So namely, compare those, to offices that cannot be subject to gerrymandering. So statewide elected offices, council of state elections, that sort of thing.
And for that second question that you said you addressed relating to the county clusters and actually looking at the contours of the district, how did you go about doing that at a high level?
So there I looked at voting data at the VTD level for Attorney General. And so I know, again, we heard about the Attorney General race the other day, but just briefly, this was the race between Josh Stein and Buck Newton that was extremely close, and so that was a good proxy for partisanship in all sorts of ways. And so I wanted to look at that at the VTD level, and again, compare that to the contours of the actual lines as they exist today. I also looked at county level voting data to try to get a better sense of the counties themselves. So for example, if you're looking at a county cluster that includes Granville, it's helpful to know that Granville is one of the 4 counties in North Carolina that voted for both President Trump and Roy Cooper, right? That's a pretty good sign that it's a competitive county, that it's a swing county in a lot of ways.
And that third question that you said you addressed, which was looking at the map files from the hard drive of Dr. Hoffler, how did you go about that part of your analysis?
So there I inspected a series of files that were in a program called Maptitude for redistricting. So I had a GIS expert open those for me, download them, unencrypt them, open them so I could watch them be opened, and then I asked him to take specific screenshots of portions of those files.
So I'm going to talk to you about your conclusions after that, if you performed all those different pieces of analysis in a bit. But can you tell us just how your expertise in North Carolina's political history and state politics helped you answer those questions that you talked about?
Sure. So in a host of ways. One, I think it helped me understand what data I could bring to bear. So for example, I knew that it doesn't make a lot of sense to look at voter registration data in the state of North Carolina because unaffiliated voters are our second largest category. And by 2022, it'll be our largest category of voters if trends continue. I think I had to understand, again, the specifics of these counties and how they vote. I wanted to be aware not only of tools that political scientists use, but also tools that people in North Carolina use. So if I wanted to understand the potential lean of a district, I would want to know, and I do know, that relying on folks like Civitas or the North Carolina Free Enterprise Institute can actually give me some data from our state, developed by people in our state that try to help us understand those very questions.
Your Honors, at this time, plaintiffs offer Dr. Cooper as an expert in political science with a specialty in the political geography and political history of North Carolina.
No objection, Your Honor.
Sorry.
It is an expert in this area.
Thank you. Mr. Branch?
No objection.
Mr. Cox?
No objection.
All right. His testimony will be received as proffered.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, Dr. Cooper, let's start with the first question that you said you looked at, which is the General Assembly being out of step with what you see statewide in North Carolina. Did you reach any conclusions with respect to your comparison of the North Carolina General Assembly's partisan composition and statewide voting patterns that you looked at?
Sure. Yes, I did.
And what were the conclusions that you reached?
Essentially that it is out of step, that our General Assembly, and to some degree our congressional delegation, although that's not what's at stake here, stand in stark contrast to other elected offices in the state of North Carolina. That we are, pick your term, a purple state, a swing state, a moderate state, a two-party state. But the one thing that seems to run in contrast to that is our General Assembly.
So let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 255. And so, Dr. Cooper, could you tell us what we're looking at here in Plaintiff's Exhibit 255?
Sure. And this is the rank of North Carolina in presidential Democratic vote share among the 50 states.
And how does this fit in with the conclusion that you testified to a moment ago?
So I'll just walk us through this real quickly. So the x-axis, the horizontal axis here is just years. It's exactly what it looks.
I understand.
That's okay. The x-axis or the horizontal axis just lays out the year by presidential election years. So we start in 1980, 84, 88, and so on. And then the y-axis, the vertical axis, shows us where North Carolina ranks compared to other states. Now, I think this is a good way to look at where North Carolina fits because we know that certain presidential election years, certain candidates from a party do a lot better than others. So, for example, in 1984, Ronald Reagan won everything except for Minnesota and Washington, D.C. So just to say that's a blue year or that's a red year can be kind of misleading. So the highest number here, the 50, would be the state that voted the most Democratic for that candidate for president. The bottom would be the state that voted the least for that. And so and the dotted line in the middle is the median. And so what this shows us is that over time, North Carolina looks more and more like the average state, the moderate state, the two-party state. That despite the fact that, we might, sometimes people will say, 2008 we went for the Democrat, 2012 we went for the Republican. Yes, that's true, but at the same time, we actually got closer to the median in each of these successive elections.
Dr. Cooper, we're going to be talking about a number of these figures and other tables that are contained within your expert report. Is this Exhibit 255, this graph that we're looking at, is that something you created?
It is.
And are you familiar with all of the data that's included there?
Yes, I am.
And is that true of all the other exhibits that are contained within your expert report?
Yes.
Okay. So let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 256. And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here?
So this is, this one's kind of simple to explain, I think. This is familiar to most people in the room. The North Carolina Council of State election results from 2004 to 2016. So you can see them displayed on the x-axis there, each one. And then it's just a simple count of the number of Democratic victories in the last 4 elections. And so if we are a state that leans, way to the Democratic Party, you'd expect to see a lot of 4s. If we're a state that leans way to the Republican Party, you'd expect to see a lot of 0s. Instead, what we see is something in the middle. Secretary of State and Attorney General have gone to the Democratic candidate 4 out of the last 4 elections. Commissioner of Labor, Commissioner of Agriculture, Commissioner of Labor and Commissioner of Agriculture, 0 out of the last 4 elections, so none. And the rest are somewhere in the middle. And so what this tells me is it's one more piece of data reinforcing this idea that we're not a Democratic state, we're not a Republican state, we're a 2-party state, we're somewhere in the middle.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 257, which is on page 8 of your expert report.
Okay.
So Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in Plaintiff's Exhibit 257?
This is the percent of the Republican 2-party vote share in North Carolina General Assembly elections 2012 to 2018. And so the bars on the x-axis represent 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2018. The lighter bars are the Senate, the darker bars are the House. And then on the y-axis, the vertical axis, it just shows us the Republican percent. And I think what this tells us, again, is a similar story. The Republicans got just over 50% of the 2-party vote share in 2012. They upped that to just shy of 55%, depending on the chamber, in 2014. In 2016, you see similar patterns. And then in 2018, the Democrats got just barely more than half of the 2-party vote share. So again, taken as a whole, this is one more piece of data that I think suggests that our citizens don't tend to lean far left, they don't tend to lean far right. It's a 2-party state, we're somewhere in the middle.
So we've been looking at some statewide measures of voter partisanship. Let's take a look at your analysis of the North Carolina General Assembly.
Great.
So could we put up Plaintiff's Exhibit 259? So Dr. Cooper, could you tell us what Plaintiff's Exhibit 259 is?
Sure. This is the percentage of seats held by the Democrats in the General Assembly from 2001 to 2018. So the x-axis just has each year represented, and the y-axis is pretty simple. It's just the percent Democrat. And so what we see is that, in 2001 in North Carolina, like throughout the South, the Democrats were doing very well, in this case in particular in our Senate. In 2010, the year prior to redistricting, we saw a big shift in North Carolina like we saw across the country. So this is consistent with Project Red Map in 2010, where the Republicans gained, I believe, 21 chambers in 1 year. So this is part of this bigger national trend. The Republican Party put a lot of attention on state legislative elections, and that attention was successful. It was successful here, it was successful in other states as well. But then what we see is that instead of that being a blip, that essentially Project Red Map worked very, very well. Following redistricting, that trend continued to decline, obviously through the supermajority years, and then with a slight rebound in 2018, just like we had throughout the country. So I think Democrats gained about 300 seats, if I remember correctly, across the country in 2018, and so North Carolina, you see the small bump there as well.
Can we put up as a split screen Plaintiff Exhibit 257 and Plaintiff Exhibit 259? And Dr. Cooper, could you just tell us what comparing these two allows you to conclude?
Sure. So here I would just focus on the right side of 259, so the right side of the right screen, if you will. And you can see that our the two-party vote share throughout this time period remained relatively close to 50-50, but the percentage of seats held by Democrats never approached those numbers. Okay, so this is not, it's not that it's close, it's not that it's a rounding error. I think this is a sign of sort of gross disproportionality.
Can we put up Plaintiff's Exhibit 264? And Dr. Cooper, what is Plaintiff's Exhibit 264?
This is a table essentially of the data we just looked at. So the graphs, I think, tell a good story, but you lose some of the granularity that you see here. And so this is just a table comparing the two-party votes, the percentage of the two-party votes, to the percentage of seats in the General Assembly from 2012 to 2018. So you can see each one of these years. You can see the House and the Senate represented. And I won't walk everybody through every part of this figure, I promise. But maybe we'll just grab 2018 just to make sure we can all read it together. In 2018, the Senate, 50.5% of the two-party votes went to the Democratic candidates, but 42% of the seats did. In the House, we see 51.1 and 46%. So you just apply the same logic to the other rows.
So Dr. Cooper, you've been talking about some statewide measures. Did you do any analysis of the voting margins within districts?
I did.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 262. This is on page 15 of your report.
Okay. And
Dr.
do I have a notebook with any of that in it?
You can have this one, Dr.
Yeah. Thank you.
It should have all of them in there, I think.
If it doesn't, it's all right.
There should be Exhibit 262 in there.
If you need it. Okay. Might be a little easier if I just look at it here as opposed to facing here. But so anyway, this is the North Carolina State Senate electoral margins in 2018, and you can see the 0 right in the middle. You can see Republican margins on the right. You can see Democratic margins on the left. And this is just a histogram, just a simple way to put little bins around numbers. And as I discuss in my expert report, the trend you think you see here kind of is the trend that is true, that the Republican victories tend to be, first of all, there's more Republican victories, obviously, and then they tend to be clustered closer to 0. In other words, they are safe seats, but they are not wasting a lot of Republican votes. The Democratic margins, however, are much greater on average. So what that means is there's a less efficient transfer of votes to seats for the Democrats than for the Republicans in the Senate.
So in this Exhibit 262, we're looking at North Carolina State Senate election margins. Can we take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 263? Dr. Cooper, what is Plaintiff's Exhibit 263 showing us?
Very similar thing, one might argue identical for our House. So what we see is each of these vote margins with 0 in the middle, and we see that when Democrats win, they tend to win by very large margins. When Republicans win, they tend to win by smaller margins. And I have the details of that analysis, kind of the averages in my expert report.
So you've been talking about vote margins and translations of votes to seats. Are you suggesting that the number of seats a party wins should be proportional to the number of, the number of votes a party receives should be proportional to the number of seats a party wins?
I'm not.
What are you using this analysis, this data that we're looking at here for as part of your analysis?
Again, so I think this is one piece of data of many that suggest, not that we're trying to be proportional, but this is gross disproportionality. This isn't close. This isn't a rounding error. This isn't something anywhere close to, this is gross disproportionality. And I think that's really what I'm trying to show here, again, with this and with the other pieces of data we'll look at.
Did you look at any other sources of data on this question of the lopsidedness of victories between the two parties in the General Assembly?
I did.
And was that the data from the Civitas Institute that you include in your report?
Yes.
And could you just tell us briefly what the Civitas Institute is?
So the Civitas Institute, I've got the quotes, I think, in my report, but I think everybody in the room would probably agree it is a conservative-leaning think tank, for lack of a better term, in the state of North Carolina. One nice thing about Civitas is they've got a host of very useful data on our states, both our legislators and our elections.
We won't go through it all today, but is your analysis of that Civitas Institute data included in your expert report of April this year?
It is.
So we've been talking about the partisanship of the North Carolina General Assembly, as well as the partisanship statewide in North Carolina. Did you also compare, or did you also look at the political ideology of the North Carolina General Assembly and North Carolina citizens?
Yes.
So let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 258.
Okay.
And Dr. Cooper, what is Plaintiff's Exhibit 258?
So this is the 2016 measure of citizen political ideology by state. So I'll explain what I mean by that. I mentioned earlier that political scientists have developed a variety of measures to try to get at average citizen ideology. Okay, and so this is just one of those developed by 4 political scientists. I will note before I go into this one that the results don't really vary if we look at other measures. So sort of the most popular competing measure gives almost the exact same answer. And so all this does is just rank each state's citizenry by political ideology. So the higher or the more liberal, the lower or the more conservative. And before I get to North Carolina, I'll just kind of point out that this sort of fits with what we might imagine, right, without even looking at the data. So if you look at the top, Oklahoma, Idaho, North Dakota, Wyoming, I think we would all agree these are probably pretty conservative citizenry. At the bottom, you see Connecticut, Vermont, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. These are fairly liberal states for the most part. So I think this is a sign this has some face validity. And so then what we see is North Carolina really smack in the middle. And if you look at the states around North Carolina, they tend to be states like Florida, Virginia, Colorado, Pennsylvania. These are the same swing states that we tend to talk about when we talk about swing states in America, when we talk about moderate states, when we talk about states up for grabs. So I think this is one indicator that North Carolina citizens are fairly moderate or fairly average.
So here we're looking at citizen political ideology. Did you also look at the political ideology of the North Carolina General Assembly?
I did.
So let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 260, which is on page 12 of your report. Dr. Cooper, could you tell us what we're looking at here in Plaintiff's Exhibit 260?
Sure. This is another measure developed by political scientists. So this one in particular was developed by somebody at the University of Houston, and Princeton University. And on the x-axis, you see years. And on the y-axis, or the vertical axis, you see the ideologies, the average ideology score of members of our General Assembly. And so the darker line is the House ideology, the dotted line is the Senate ideology. And so what this tells us, I think, isn't rocket science, that when we became a much more Republican legislature, we got much more conservative legislators, right? This is not really a surprise to probably anyone in the room, but I think what this tells us is this isn't just party. It's not that we flipped in terms of partisanship, but that the ideology of our members stayed the same. The substantive ideology of our legislators shifted along with the partisanship of our General Assembly.
Have you compared the political ideology of the North Carolina General Assembly to other state legislatures?
I have.
Okay. Can we take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 261? And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here?
So this is the state legislative ideology in 2016. And you can see the ones on the top are the most conservative state legislatures, and so those are all the way to the right and at the top. And then on the bottom and to the left, you see the more liberal state legislatures. And again, I'll just say this one has some face validity, right? Texas, Missouri, Oklahoma, these are pretty conservative state legislatures, I think we'd all agree. California, Connecticut, New Jersey, fairly liberal, I think we'd all agree. And here you see North Carolina, certainly not at the most conservative, but a large deviation from where our citizenry is in terms of rank. I would also add that in the previous graph, North Carolina was around the swing states, right? We were around Colorado, we were around Virginia, we were around states like that. Here we're sandwiched between Utah and Montana. So our General Assembly ideologically resembles Utah and Montana. Our citizenry, on average, resembles states like Florida and Virginia and Wisconsin.
Dr. Cooper, you've already mentioned the Civitas Institute. Did you also look at data from the Civitas Institute on this question of political ideology?
I did. So Civitas, sort of two parts of their data that I used. One was the rankings of the districts themselves, as we talked about, and the other is they have a measure of the ideological rankings of individual members of our General Assembly.
And is that analysis that you performed of that data contained in your April expert report in this case?
It is.
So Dr. Cooper, I want to move on now to the second set of questions or issues that you said that you looked at as part of your work in this case. And that is the question of the actual boundaries of the districts and the county clusters that you analyzed. Did you reach any conclusions with respect to your analysis of the county clusters and districts that you looked at?
Sure. And so I want to say at the outset, this is all in the context within county clusters. So again, I promise everybody I will not go into a long explanation of county clusters. I think we got it. But all of this analysis is contained within the county clusters. And the big takeaway to me, after going through all of these data and all of these clusters, is that there is discretion within a cluster. And whenever that discretion was used, it was consistently to benefit one party, in this case the Republican Party, at the expense of the other party, in this case the Democratic Party.
When you were performing your analysis of these districts and their boundaries, did you analyze how those district boundaries split municipalities in North Carolina?
I did.
And did you reach any conclusion with respect to the split of municipalities by these districts?
Sure. And here I'll say at the outset, some municipalities have to be split. We all know that. We all understand population provisions. The question is, where are these municipalities split, and how many municipalities are split that don't need to be split? And what I saw again was there were many municipalities that were split, and there couldn't seem to be any other explanation that I could come up with other than partisanship. So for example, if you've got a Democratic pocket of voters in an urban area in a municipality, and that is cracked or split between two districts, that then reduces the voting power of those voters.
So Dr. Cooper, you mentioned in your last answer the term cracked or cracking. Mm-hmm. Could you explain what you mean by that term, cracking?
Sure. So if you've got a large number of a party in a specific geographic area together, and you split them into two districts, you therefore reduce their voting power, right? So instead of being able to vote as a block, they're voting in two separate districts. So you're therefore cracking those voters across two or sometimes more districts.
I think we've heard some testimony in this case already using the term packing. Mm-hmm. Do you have an understanding of what that term means?
Sure. So that's sort of the flip side of that coin, I guess. Packing is when you put as many of the opposing party's voters in one district as you can. So the idea there is that that party will then, waste votes. In other words, every vote, they will win those seats by relatively large margins. And so what that does is it makes the districts around much more competitive for the party who's drawing the lines.
Let's talk about the data that you looked at as part of your analysis of these county clusters and the districts within them. What data was it that you used to perform this analysis?
So the primary data I used was the VTD level. And so again, we've heard about VTDs. I won't go there again. VTD level analysis of the Attorney General race. And for many of the reasons we've heard about already, it was a competitive race. It's a good indicator of voting patterns.
You mentioned in the beginning of your testimony that voter registration would not be as good of a measure. Could you just explain
Sure.
why that is?
Yeah, so there's two primary reasons that voter registration is not a great indicator of voting patterns in North Carolina. One is what's true throughout the South. We've had an ideological realignment, we've had a partisan realignment in the South. So we know that party registration is a lagging indicator. And what I mean by that is that somebody will tend to change their voting patterns before they go all the way to the Board of Elections and change which party they're registered for, right? So you see many folks who may be registered Democrats but vote for Republicans. And again, this is particularly an issue in the U.S. South. The second reason is somewhat particular to North Carolina, and I mentioned that briefly. Right now, the greatest number of party registrants is Democrat, then unaffiliated, then Republican. And that is a relatively recent phenomenon in North Carolina politics. And I think I mentioned this before, if current trends continue, by 2022, unaffiliated will be the largest category in North Carolina politics. There's 10 or 11, I can't remember which one, counties where unaffiliated is already the largest voter registration group in North Carolina. And so if you're trying to understand voting patterns and you've got unaffiliated voters at the second position or sometimes even the first position, it makes it a lot harder to understand how people will vote.
So you used the 2016 Attorney General's election results as
Yes.
part of your analysis. Did you use any other data when you were performing your cluster by cluster analysis?
Yeah, so each one of these clusters, as you read through, I first try to just give some context of the place. First, just talk about the counties in which these clusters are located, give a sense of what the political geography of these counties is like. Do these counties, is it a Graham County that leans far right? Is it a Mecklenburg County that leans far left? Is it a Granville County that's somewhere in the middle? So sort of situating it there. I then took the VTD level voting analysis, or the VTD level voting patterns, asked the GIS expert to create a map for me, which would have those data displayed visually with the contours of the current district lines on top of them.
And did you use any other data from third-party organizations or think tanks like those you've mentioned already?
Sure. So I also looked at the Civitas data and the North Carolina Free Enterprise Institute data to give a sense of what those groups thought about these districts and these clusters. So it's not that gerrymandering always happens where, party A always wins and party B never wins. The key is moving the needle a little bit and moving the needle consistently in one direction as opposed to the other. So I had to think about it like a game of tug of war. So if Mr. Sell and I are in a game of tug of war and he gets to start a little bit closer to the midpoint, he may win or I may win. It depends on which one of us is bigger and stronger, probably him. But it's sure going to help if he's a lot closer to the middle at the beginning. And so I think that's kind of how gerrymandering works. It's not as simple as this party won this race, this party lost this race. It's how were the decks stacked for or against that party before the election started.
So you mentioned that as part of this analysis you used maps.
Yes,
Did you have any assistance in the creation of those maps?
I did.
And from whom did you have assistance?
So Blake Esselstyn, who we've heard some about already, during this case, created those maps under my direction. So essentially, I should mention at the outset, Mr. Esselstyn lives in Asheville. I live in Silva, pretty close together. So I would visit Mr. Esselstyn's office. I would ask him to create maps for me. I would say, can you please create a map of the Mecklenburg County cluster? I would like the map to look a certain way. He would then create those maps, sometimes in front of me, sometimes he would send them to me later.
And were you familiar with Mr. Esselstyn before working with him on the maps in this case?
I was.
And how so?
So just coincidentally, he, like I said, we live fairly close to each other. I also mentioned that we run a Master of Public Affairs program at Western Carolina that's in Asheville. And so a few years ago, we wanted to offer a GIS class. And so I reached out to all my GIS contacts and said, who's the best GIS person in the region who could teach this class? And they suggested Blake. So I interviewed Blake, hired Blake, went and witnessed his class, wrote teaching evaluations of him, the whole 9 yards. So yes, I did know him before.
And do you have an understanding of how Mr. Esselstyn actually produced the visual depictions, the maps that you're talking about, that you directed him to create?
I do. So he created these maps in QGIS using a common data set that we both had access to.
Dr. Cooper, who decided what information to include on these maps that are in your expert report?
I did. So as I mentioned before, I would ask Mr. Esselstyn to create a map that showed something. Maybe I found something interesting in a certain cluster, and I would come to him with ideas about how to present that visually. So it's just taking the data we both had access to and then getting him to present that visually. I will add that as everybody here knows, the General Assembly has a really nice redistricting website, and that includes detailed maps of each of these county clusters and the lines that are included. So I was also able to confirm not only the data, because we both had access to the common data, but also to look at his lines and to compare those to the lines that were on the General Assembly's website.
So I want to talk about these maps, and the actual maps themselves, but let's start by looking at Plaintiff's Exhibit 271, which is a legend for some of the maps that we're going to be talking about. This is on page 26 of your expert report. But Dr. Cooper, can you tell us what this is that we're looking at?
Sure. So this is the legend for what I'm calling the area maps. And so you'll see in each one of these, every cluster has an area map. Certain clusters have other maps, and we can get to those. But the one common feature is they all have this area map. And so this one happens to be the Anson Union County cluster. So this includes districts 55, 69, and 68. And you can see those numbers obviously in black, and you can see the Union and the Anson counties that are in, I don't know, I guess that's sort of a gray with a white outline. And then when I mentioned a municipality in my report, I asked Mr. Esselstyn to also write the name of that municipality, or to superimpose the name of that municipality on the map. And so you can see that with Monroe.
Is that on the,
I'm sorry, you can see that on with Monroe.
oh, the rock?
Sorry. Got it. Okay, thanks. You can also see the county. So you can see the sort of I guess sort of greenish line in the middle that shows the county difference. You can also see the dark grayed areas at the bottom. This is obviously on the border of South Carolina. So here, when you go into South Carolina, you like go into some abyss, I guess. But anyway, it turns very gray there. And then you can see the vote margin per acre. And you see those numbers 6, 4, 2, 0, 2, 4, 6, and the D and the R. And so this is hopefully familiar to most people, right? You've got the blue is Democratic, the red is Republican, but these are normalized per acre. And so just to interpret this a little more fully, for example, the 6R, so the dark red 6, would mean that there are 6 more Republican votes per acre than Democratic votes. This is not percent, this is raw vote total. So the 6 on the blue side, on the left side there, would obviously be the opposite, that it would be a VTD that has 6 more Democratic than Republican votes per VTD.
And when you're talking about votes, again, you're talking about that 2016 Attorney General's election that you mentioned before?
I am.
Dr. Cooper, we're going to be talking about a number of these maps, but were they all created at your direction in the same way by Mr. Esselstyn?
Yes.
And all of these maps that have the shading that you were talking about creating with Mr. Esselstyn, those are included in your expert report of April of this year?
That's correct.
And are you familiar with the district boundaries and the other boundaries that are included in all of those maps?
Yes.
And are you familiar with all the data, including the 2016 Attorney General's race election data that is color-coded on those maps?
Yes.
So let's move into the actual districts and county clusters that you analyzed. Can we put up Plaintiff's Exhibit 272? And Dr. Cooper, what is Plaintiff's Exhibit 272?
So this is Senate Districts 8 and 9. This is Bladen and Pender and Brunswick and New Hanover County. And this is a really nice illustration of a few concepts. One, New Hanover County is slightly too big to be one district. And so it's not enough just to look at any of these clusters and say, hey, they happen to break some line. That in and of itself is not a good or a bad thing. Sometimes you just have to do it. And this is one of those cases. The map maker had to break into New Hanover County somewhere. The question is, where did the map maker break into New Hanover County? And what we see is this Wilmington notch, these two VTDs that you can see very clearly are extremely blue, right, extremely Democratic, and those are the two. I'll note those two VTDs are also split. And just to give you a sense of how blue those VTDs are, Stein got 86% of the vote in one of the VTDs and 93% of the vote in the other VTD. And so if you just look across the border, right, it's hard to find any other decision the map maker could have made that would have had the same effect, that would have taken those blue voters and put them in District 8, which is clearly a district that's going to lean heavily towards the Republican Party. So this is how you get a county like New Hanover, which is, you know, a fairly moderate county, and with some Democratic strongholds, and then you combine that with a series of very Republican counties, and this is how you gerrymander a map like this.
I want to turn to the Wilmington notch in a second, but just while we have this exhibit in front of you here, I do see some white on the map as well, and just so it's clear in the record, you talked about the red and the blue, but what does the white color show us?
So the white are more competitive, but again, keep in mind these are standardized by acre, and so what that means is sometimes things look white just because they're really big VTDs. There may not be as many voters in them. So if you think about something around a military base, for example, sometimes they look a little wider than they should. But the idea is the white districts are the more competitive ones that by acre, it's not a large advantage for one party or the other.
The whiter, in other words, is closer to a 50-50 vote share.
Per acre, yes.
Okay.
Per acre, yes.
And Dr. Cooper, just to be 100% clear, I think you might have said white-colored maps showing districts, and you're talking about white-colored VTDs as they're depicted on your
Yes,
maps. Is that
white.
right?
Yes, I thought that's what you meant. The white VTDs.
So let's turn now to this Wilmington notch, which you mentioned a moment ago. Can we look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 273?
Mm-hmm.
This is page 30 of your expert report. Dr. Cooper, what is Plaintiff's Exhibit 273 showing us?
It's just a zoom in of this Wilmington notch. And again, I think it makes this point pretty clearly. Again, there had to be a place you were going to break into New Hanover County. That's not a bad thing. The question is where. And I think what we're going to see with all these clusters is whenever there was discretion to be exercised, that discretion tended to go in favor of one party, in this case the Republican Party, and against the other party, in this case the Democratic Party. And so you can see the two VTDs, W03 and W29, clearly labeled, and you can see that split.
All right, so let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 274. And Dr. Cooper, what is this map showing us?
So this is Senate Districts 10, 11, and 12. So this is Nash, Johnson, Harnett, Lee, Sampson, Duplin counties. And if you look at, probably the best thing to look at here is District 11. So you can see really clearly the first thing your eyes probably grabbed, if you're like mine, is this bright blue dot at Rocky Mount. Okay, so clearly if you are a map maker and you are thinking about partisanship, you're going to notice this. And if you have access to these data, that's the first thing that will come to mind. So if you're trying to draw these lines to benefit the Republican Party, you've got to somehow connect those blue voters to heavily Republican VTDs somewhere else. Right? It's going to be very hard to pull out, much less pull out a victory, but to put the odds in your favor without doing so. And so it crosses the county line, again, by itself, not a bad thing. It has to cross the county line. Nash County's not that big. But the question is, where does it cross that line, and how does it connect, more importantly, to those other VTDs? And you can see this pathway from blue to red that's, almost like a highway.
I think you have another map of this county cluster in your report. Can we go to Plaintiff's Exhibit 275? And Dr. Cooper, what is this showing us?
This is just a close-up of what we just looked at and what I just tried to draw everybody's attention to, the connection of Rocky Mount to these primarily red VTDs, right? So the idea, again, is Rocky Mount's there. It's not going anywhere. The county cluster rule says it has to be there. So how do you dilute those Democratic voters? You connect them with Republican voters elsewhere. In this case, Republican voters near the Riverwood and Noose golf clubs.
Dr. Cooper, do you know what the election results have been recently in these 3 Senate districts that we're looking at here?
Yeah, I do. So these were, if I remember right, I'll check my memory here. Republicans won all 3 of these, and the Civitas action scores, which again is a measure of legislator ideology, for all 3 of these legislators was 87.5. So towards the high end of the scale. Higher is more conservative, lower is more liberal.
Let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 276, which is on page 35 of your report. And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in this map?
Okay, so this is, if anybody doesn't know what we're looking at here, you have to leave the courtroom. No, that's not true. This is the Wake County cluster, and so you can see Raleigh pretty clearly displayed. And I think there's a few stories here. One is you can see clear Democratic packing in 16 and 15, but and to some degree 14. And we'll talk about that. But I think perhaps the more interesting piece is Senate District 18. So you can see you're starting in Franklin County. You've got to cross the county line. Not a problem in and of itself. The question is, which VTDs do you then grab when you enter Wake County? And so what you'll see is 18 kind of snakes its way down and grabs a red VTD there, and then grabs those, sort of makes its way through to making sure that the blue in Franklin County gets essentially washed out in this larger sea of red.
You mentioned that in this county, Raleigh is split between the Senate districts we're looking at.
Yes.
So let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 277. And Dr. Cooper, what is this map showing us?
So we'll see a few of these today, so I'll try to just orient everybody one time to what this looks like and what we're looking at and save some time later. So these maps are meant to show municipality splits. And the colors are important in that they show where one municipality ends or census designated area ends and where another one begins. But there's nothing inherently meaningful in the colors. So the fact that Cary's purple doesn't mean they're big, Western Carolina fans or something. It just happens to be colored purple here. So you can see pretty clearly that Raleigh is split. And again, Raleigh has to be split. There's no problem with splitting Raleigh. The problem is how many times Raleigh split and where Raleigh split. You can also see Zebulon gets split over on the east side. You can see a split at Garner. You, of course, can see split of Cary, which is probably not a problem by itself, but Cary's actually in 3 districts in this cluster. You can see a few other municipal splits, but I think those are the primary ones.
So you're talking about the split of these different municipalities, and you've mentioned Raleigh in particular. Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 278.
Okay.
And Dr. Cooper, this looks to be a little bit different than the maps we've looked at so far. So could you tell us what we're looking at here in Plaintiff's Exhibit 278?
Sure, and we'll see a few more of these today, so I'll take a little more time the first time, if that's all right. This is just the Raleigh city limits, okay? So this isn't Wake County in general, this is just within the Raleigh city limits. And so you can see that the color coding's the same, so I'm not changing anything on you there. And you can see Center District 14, you can look all day long, and you're not going to find a single red VTD. You can look in 15, same thing. You can look in 16, same thing. You can look at 18, and you can see that the only red VTDs in the city of Raleigh are pieced together in Senate District 18. And so, by itself, is this a sign of a gerrymander? I don't know. Consistently, when you see these kinds of decisions made, I think it is very, very good evidence of a consistent pattern to benefit one party, namely the Republicans, at the expense of the other party, namely the Democrats.
So Dr. Cooper, let's move to a different Senate county cluster. Could we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 281? And we actually saw this exhibit a little earlier today during Mr. Brown's testimony, but Dr. Cooper, could you tell us what we're looking at here and how it fits in with your analysis?
Sure. Now we're back to the area map, so I'll spare you the long orientation. This is Senate Districts 24, 26, 27, and 28. So you can see Guilford, Alamance, Randolph counties.
And what does this allow you to conclude about the partisan impact of the particular district boundaries we're looking at here?
So I think the primary thing to look at here, actually was sort of previewed earlier today really, is Senate District 26. So Randolph County had to be combined with some VTDs in some other county. There's nothing wrong with that inherently. The question is, where is that decision made? Once you know you have to cross that county line, which VTDs do you take from that county? And so you can look right along the northern county line and you can see that it was a clear decision to take the most Democratic VTDs that were remaining on the border and to put those in 26, therefore washing out the voters, the Democratic voters in High Point, which are overwhelmingly Democratic, and placing them in 26. Obviously, it would be a very different decision if any other VTD were included.
Dr. Cooper, you're aware that the special master in the Covington litigation redrew some of the districts that we're looking at in this cluster?
I am.
But does that affect your analysis that you were just sharing with us of Senate District 26 in
No,
particular?
nothing I just said was affected by the special master.
Dr. Cooper, do you happen to recall the results of the most recent, the 2018 elections in Senate Districts 26 and 27 to its north?
I'll just check my expert report to make sure I don't commit my own math error. In the 2018 elections, Republicans won 26, SD 26, as expected. So 26 is this Randolph County, including High Point. So Republicans won that district, while a Democrat got a 1-point victory in 27. So despite this big blue wave, it took a big blue wave to get even a 1-point victory out of 27.
Right, so Dr. Cooper, let's continue our tour onto a different Senate county cluster. Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 282 on page 43 of your expert report. Page 43. So Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in this map?
Yeah, so here's Forsyth and Davie counties, Senate Districts 31 and 32, of course, centering around the big blue dot that is Winston-Salem.
And how does this fit with the conclusions that you've been talking to us about today?
Yeah, very similarly. So if you are a map maker and you're trying to draw lines to benefit one party at the expense of the other, and you're looking at this county cluster, you've obviously got a problem with the big blue dot that is Winston-Salem. And so what happened here was to grab the most Republican part of Winston-Salem, and I think we'll look at another graph that'll show how much that's true. So to grab that little scoop out, and then I think it's also notable that not only does it grab that part, but then it wraps all the way around Winston-Salem and then grabs the eastern part of the county and the county cluster. So 31 goes from the eastern side to the northern part of this cluster, to the western part of the cluster, and to the southern part of this cluster.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 283 to get another perspective on what you're talking about. And Dr. Cooper, what does this exhibit show us?
So this is another one of these city-focused maps, so interpretable kind of the way I explained it before. So this is just the Winston-Salem city limits, and you can see District 32, all the VTDs in Winston-Salem, and 32 on the left, all the VTDs in 31 on the right, and you can see, if you see nothing else, you don't see any red on the left, and you see red on the right. So what that means is, I guess there's actually a tiny little bit of pink on the left, but the real Republican-leaning VTDs from Winston-Salem are all falling in Senate District 31, despite the fact that some are on the west side of town, some are on the east side of town, and some are on the north side of town.
Sticking with Winston-Salem, can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 284, which is on page 45 of your report?
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Cooper, this map looks a little different than the ones we've seen before as well. So could you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so this is just a zoom in of one particular part, and we'll see just a couple of these today, just a small number, but they're meant just to give you a sense of what it would feel like as a voter. You're trying to navigate your political environment, you're trying to understand your district lines, what would it actually feel like on the ground. And so this is a relatively small area. You can see it's about, you can see the 4-mile mark on the bottom. Center District 31 in green, 32 in yellow. This is another one. Don't read anything into the colors other than they're showing the difference between these places. And so South Peacehaven Road is kind of an interesting one. If you are going south to north, you start at South Peacehaven Road, you're in Senate District 31. You then form the border between 31 and 32, so you're kind of straddling them. You're then back into 31, and then you're back into 32 before you end at Polo Road.
Dr. Cooper, do you happen to recall what the election results were in these two Senate districts we're looking at here in 2018?
Just jog my memory quickly. So Senate District 32, the Democrat won by 45 percentage points, 4-5, and the Republican won by 22.5 percentage points, so about half. So again, fitting with this larger pattern, right? When the Democrats win, they're winning by very large margins. When the Republicans win, they're winning by safe margins, but they're not wasting nearly as many votes.
And just so it's clear, that Senate District 32, where you just talked about the 45-point margin, that's the Senate district where we saw those blue VTDs packed in Winston-Salem?
That is correct.
Let's move on to the Mecklenburg County Senate cluster.
Great.
And pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 285. This is on page 46 of your expert report. So Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in this map?
So we're looking at Mecklenburg County. We're looking at one of, if not the most Democratic-leaning counties in our state. And you're looking at Senate Districts 37, 38, 39, 40, and 41. And again, of course, you're going to have municipal splits here. Charlotte's a big place, so there's no inherent problem there. The question is, where do those municipal splits take place, and what are the partisan effects of where these lines are drawn? So if we just maybe focus on Senate District 41 first, and I would tell you which part to zoom, but it's hard because it actually includes the southern, the northern, and the westernmost portions of this cluster. And so you can see, of course, north of Charlotte, North Mecklenburg County is going to be a little bit more Republican. South is going to be a little bit more Republican, and then you've got a lot of blue in the middle. And so to create something that is at least potentially competitive out of this cluster, the map maker brings from the south part to the north part, fitting through narrow passageways on the west side of town to create a somewhat more competitive 41 than would be there otherwise. And you can also see 39 that looks almost like a pizza slice that's got one too many slices of pepperoni on it, that kind of juts right up into Charlotte. And you can see all of that red there, right? But then in 37, in 38, and in 40, it's all blue. So you're packing Democratic voters in 38, 37, and 40. You're creating a sprawling 41 that runs on the south, north, and west sides of the county cluster. And then you're piecing together enough Republican voters in 39 so you've got a fighting chance.
So you were talking about the splits of Charlotte. Let's take another look at that in Plaintiff's Exhibit 286, which was on page 47 of your report. So Dr. Cooper, tell us what we're looking at here in this exhibit.
Yeah, so this is one of those, we're just focusing on the Charlotte city limits, so not Mecklenburg County in general, just Charlotte. And you can see Senate Districts 37, 38, and 40. I mean, as bright blue as you can imagine. You can see 41, that's that kind of funny shaped district that runs south to west to north, and you can see a little bit of red included there to try to make that more competitive. And then you can see the clear focus on 39, a pizza slice right there out of the bottom of Charlotte.
And you were speaking a moment ago about Senate District 41, which is that sprawling one that goes from north to south in this county. Can we pull up Plaintiff Exhibit 287, which is on page 48 of your report?
Sure.
And what are we looking at in this map, Dr. Cooper?
So this is another one, don't read anything into the colors other than they're showing you different districts. And you can see how small these passageways are. So this is kind of in that elbow.
Small passageways?
passageway, I'm sorry. I can start again, okay. So you can see that small passageway that was kind of in the southwest elbow, I guess, of this. That's the Arrowwood Quarry. So that's literally how narrow this is. It's just narrow enough for a single quarry to squeeze through and to connect these parts of Mecklenburg County that don't seem to be connected together for any other reason.
And could we just put up Plaintiff's Exhibit 287 with a split screen of Plaintiff's Exhibit 285? And Dr. Cooper, if you would, could you just show us on Plaintiff's Exhibit 285, the full county map,
Sure.
where this zoomed in map on the left is actually?
Not a great drawer, but that should orient you pretty well. You can see the little elbow. See coming right out. You can see that narrow passageway. You can see the little jut out at the top.
All right, so let's move on to another Senate District County cluster. Can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 288? I think now we're back sort of your neck of the woods, in the western part of the state. So Dr. Cooper, can you tell us what we're looking at here in Plaintiff's Exhibit 288?
Sure, yeah, we are back in the western part of the state. So this is Senate Districts 48 and 49, so Transylvania, Henderson, and Buncombe counties. And here you can see the bright blue dot that is Asheville, right in the middle of western North Carolina. And so the key here, if you're a map maker, is again, not that you're going to necessarily win every district, you're not going to. It's to make small decisions, but all these small decisions that are consistent, and they're consistently favoring one party at the expense of the other party. So you can see here, combining the city of Asheville, of course, with that bright blue dot in Black Mountain over here, separating from Brevard, from Hendersonville, and making sure that 48 stays red and sort of giving 49 to the other party.
And are you familiar with the election results, the recent election results in these two Senate districts?
I am.
And
So 48, the Republican Party wins 48 and the Democratic Party wins 49. See if I have the data here. Democrats have won 49 by large margins, Republicans have won 48 in all 4 elections since this district was created.
So, Dr. Cooper, we've been talking about the Senate districts that you took a look at as part of your analysis. Did you look at state House districts as well?
I did.
So let's move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 289.
We're going to take a break at this point, and we'll start pick up right there. So we'll be in break until 4 o'clock. It's 15 minutes.
Thank you, Judge.
Priscilla?
Yes, Your Honor. So, Dr. Cooper, let's pick up where we left off, which was starting up with your analysis of the House districts that you looked at in this case. So we've got Plaintiff's Exhibit 289 up on the screen. And Dr. Cooper, what is this map showing us?
So this is House Districts, a cluster with House Districts 2 and 32. So this is Warren, Vance, Granville, and Person counties. And so we've talked about Granville as an interesting example already today. And there's, again, I think the key here isn't, obviously there's a limited set of choices that any map maker has. The question is, taken in its totality, how do those choices benefit one party at the expense of the other? And here you can see, to make 32, to pack as many of these Democratic voters in 32 as possible, there's a split of Oxford, but the key is that you're getting those blue Democratic voters in Oxford and putting them in and combining them with the Democratic voters in Henderson and over in Warrenton, and separating them from the Democratic voters to the west, and where you draw that line separating 2 and 32. So this is how you take a very competitive cluster and you turn it into one where the Democrats are likely to win one and pack some Democrats there, and then make 2 much more competitive.
Let's move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 291 on page 55 of your report. And Dr. Cooper, what is this map showing us?
So this is a cluster with House Districts 4, 14, and 15. So this is Duplin and Onslow counties. And I think the easiest thing to focus on here is the blue shark's tooth right at Jacksonville. And I think maybe we'll see some more of that. But the key is, you're a map maker. If you're trying to draw lines with partisan advantage, really either way, you've got this big blue shark's tooth to deal with. And so the way this map maker chose to draw that line was to combine that dark blue VTD that juts up sort of oddly right there, and then combine that with the red VTDs to the left, and of course then to the south. 14 then becomes Republican, and 4 also stays safely Republican.
Let's turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit 293 on page 58 of your report. Dr. Cooper, what is this map showing us?
This is House District 7 and 25, so Nash and Franklin counties. And this is another really interesting illustration, right? We've got to have a county traversal here. That's fine. You've got to cross from Franklin to Nash County somewhere. Nobody's questioning that at all. The question is, which VTDs do you pick up to try to make 7 as competitive as possible for the Republicans? You've, of course, got this blue dot over to the right. And so you can see the VTD that's included with 7 is the most Republican-leaning VTD anywhere on this border. In other words, if you had taken any other VTD, 7 becomes less favorable to Republican candidates.
Dr. Cooper, do you recall what the election results were in 2018 in these 2 House districts that we're looking at?
Let's see here. The Democrat won House District 25, and the Republican won, let's see here, sorry. And, yeah, the Republican won House District 7 by 16 percentage points.
So exactly as you'd predict based on your analysis of the particular VTDs in these districts here.
Yes, I think exactly as anyone would predict from the analysis of these VTDs and inspecting them.
Let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 294 on page 60 of the report. Dr. Cooper, tell us about this map.
So this is the cluster with House Districts 8, 9, and 12, and this is Pitt and Lenoir counties. And I think the most interesting thing to draw your attention to here is the split in Greenville. And so you're splitting Greenville right in the middle. You're grabbing and separating out or cracking these Democratic voters. And this little split, that little jut, is actually on the ECU campus. So it looked like President Trump was at ECU yesterday. I think he was speaking at Williams Arena. If there was a student who was in the library that day at ECU, they were in one district. President Trump and the rally were in another district on the same college campus.
You're talking about the split of Greenville. Let's take a look at Plaintiff Exhibit 295 on page 62 of your report. And Dr. Cooper, can you tell us what this map shows us?
Sure. This is one of those municipal split maps that we've been looking at. Again, don't read anything into the colors other than they're separate census designated places. And you can see pretty clearly where that cut comes out of Greenville and then how that affects the city.
And could we actually do a split screen of the map we were just looking at, 294, alongside Plaintiff's Exhibit 295? And Dr. Cooper, how does the map that we're looking at on the left, which you said shows us the split of municipalities in these districts, how does that relate to the conclusion that you shared earlier about the ways in which municipalities were split by the districts that you analyzed as part of this case?
Sure. So, I mean, I think, first of all, just my poor drawing skills, I believe that's the rough area we're looking at here. And I mentioned a little while ago, it's not just that municipalities are split. It's where municipalities are split and how municipalities are split, right? We're trying to communicate to voters some sort of sense of who they're represented by and how they're represented. And I think that kind of split makes it much more difficult for voters to understand the democratic process in our state.
You mentioned the term packing before. If you look at the districts here, do you see an example of that?
Sure. I think if you look at District 12, for example, you can see the sort of connection of, well, that's not really a pack as much. I think if you see 8, you see a very, very good example of that packing in the eighth district. Okay, so this district over here. So you can look very hard. It's difficult to find, other than my red marking there, red VTDs. It's very, very easy to find these blue VTDs packed into 8.
And when you pack Democratic voters into House District 8, as you're describing, what effect does that have on the other 2 House districts in this cluster?
Obviously, it makes those 2 much more competitive for Republican voters.
So let's move on to a different county cluster. And could we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 297 on page 64 of your report?
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here on Plaintiff's Exhibit 297?
So this is Wake County, and this is, I won't read them all to you. This is a whole lot of House districts in Wake County.
And Dr. Cooper, are you aware that the House districts, the House district boundaries in Wake County were recently changed?
I am.
So what borders are we looking at here in this map that you're talking about?
These are the borders as of April 2019.
All right. And did you analyze any other borders of House districts within Wake County as part of your work in this case?
I did not.
Okay. So as we look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 297 of the House districts in Wake County before they were recently changed, can you tell us how this fits with the analysis that you performed in this case?
Sure. So I think anybody can very clearly see, for example, Districts 33, District 11, District 49, District 38, where you're packing Democrats into these districts, right? So therefore you're getting a less efficient transfer of votes to seats for the Democratic candidates. And so then what does that do? You've got to find a way to free up these other districts to be more competitive for the Republican candidates. And I think that's exactly what we see happening here in 40. That's what we see happening here in 35. That's what we see happening here in 36. That's what we see happening here in 37.
When you look at the House district boundaries in this county, does that allow you to infer anything about the intent of the map makers as they were drawing these districts?
I think it does. I think it's very similar to this theme, right? That when there's discretion, and again, I would argue this is a great example of discretion within a county cluster. The county cluster rule does not mean that map makers have no discretion. They actually still have discretion within these clusters. And when that discretion is used, the question is, how is it used? Is it used in a nonpartisan manner, or is it used consistently to tip the scales for one party as opposed to the other? I think that's just what you're seeing here.
So let's move on to another House county cluster. Can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 301, which is on page 69 of your report? Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in this map?
So this is a county cluster with House Districts 16, 46, and 47.
And can you talk about your analysis of these particular House districts in this cluster?
Sure. So if you look at Senate District 47, so this is over on the left side or the west side of this map, you can see the contours of the lines around Lumberton, right around UNC Pembroke, and you can see very clearly how these lines were drawn to ensure that you're packing as many of these Democratic voters as possible into 47. So what's the goal of doing this? Of course, the goal of doing this is not to move 47 for the Republicans, but it's to make 46 and 16 much more competitive for the Republican Party.
So let's take a look at a map of another county cluster. Can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 302, which is on page 71 of your report? So Dr. Cooper, tell us what we're looking at here.
So this is, we started today with the clusters by looking at the Wilmington Notch on the Senate side. So this is the Wilmington cluster with Brunswick and New Hanover on the House side.
And talk to us about your analysis that you performed of the House district boundaries in this cluster.
Yeah, absolutely. So New Hanover County obviously leans Democratic, and Brunswick County is extremely Republican. And so the voting patterns around Wilmington are the clear thing that any map maker who's trying to draw a partisan advantage would have to deal with, right? And so you can see the most Democratic VTDs are put in 18, thereby wasting those votes. And so maybe it's kind of hard to see because of all that white, but a lot of those are low populated areas. That high population area around Wilmington is in 18, packing those Democratic voters then into 18.
And as we look at this, it looks like the district boundary between 18 and 20 is drawn with some precision around the voting, the VTDs in that particular area that you were just describing.
That's
Does that
correct.
allow you to infer anything about the intent of the map maker?
Again, I think the process to go through here is to look for alternative explanations and to think consistently across these clusters. Are there other reasons these decisions could have been made? And it is hard for me to imagine other reasons this decision could have been made. This one, if I remember correctly, also splits the UNC Wilmington campus. So we've talked about campus splits at ECU. We're talking about campus splits at UNC Wilmington.
So you mentioned the split of Wilmington, not just the campus, but the city.
Yep.
When we take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 303, which is on page 72 of your report. And Dr. Cooper, can you describe and explain what we're looking at here in this set of maps?
Sure. So this is one of those city limits maps. So this is, again, just the city limits, not all of New Hanover, just the city limits of Wilmington. And you can see, we talked about the packing that happened in 18. You can see those blue districts very clearly illustrated here. You can then see 19, and then you can then see 20. You can also see the shapes in 20, and you can see, it's not about splitting the Wilmington city limits. It's about the way in which the Wilmington city limits are split. In and of itself, a municipal split may not be a bad thing, may not have partisan intent. I think the way this one was designed is fairly clear.
And Dr. Cooper, you mentioned the split of UNC Wilmington and its campus. Let's pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 304, which is on page 73 of your expert report.
Great.
And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at a map of UNC Wilmington, and you can see 19 and 20 and 18. You can see the districts represented, and the purple here is representing those district lines. And this is put on top of a map of UNC Wilmington's campus. You can see if you're a student and you're moving from the university suites and you decide to go to the university apartments to visit your friend, you're going to be moving from District 20 to District 18. And I would say, I think these campus splits are not just an interesting factoid, but I think they're important for the way we try to understand representation in North Carolina. This is the exact age where we're trying to teach students that they should vote, that they should understand the democratic process, and these kind of splits make it even more difficult to do that.
Could we pull up a split screen with Plaintiff's Exhibit 302 that we were looking at a couple back? And Dr. Cooper, could you just show us where this zoomed in map is on the zoomed in map on the left, where that is on the right? We're looking at Wilmington, I know.
Yep. Yep. In that ballpark.
So it's sort of that boot-like appendage that swings down in District 20.
It is. It is. Yeah. It's not the greatest art, but it is.
Let's move on to another House District County cluster. We pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 305, which is on page 75 of your report. And Dr. Cooper, please tell us about this map.
Sure. This is a map of House Districts 42, 43, 44, and 45 in Cumberland County.
And how does this relate to the analysis that you performed in the case?
So I think a good one to focus on here is House District 45. You can see this backward C shape, and it's interesting, you actually end up seeing this a lot in the analyses of many of these districts. So it's an attempt, a very clear attempt, to connect these Republican-leaning districts all together and avoid the Democratic-leaning districts, or the Democratic-leaning VTDs that are right on their border. Okay, so it's creating 45 to be much better for the Republican Party, and then packing the Democratic voters, of course, into 42 and into 43.
And if we pull up, it might be best to do it as a split screen, actually. Plaintiff's Exhibit 306. First of all, Dr. Cooper, could you tell us what we're looking at in Plaintiff's Exhibit 306, which is on the right side of the screen?
Sure, this is one of those municipality split maps we've been looking at. Again, don't worry about the colors, other than just to tell you that those are separate census-designated places. And you can see Fayetteville split. And again, by itself, is splitting Fayetteville a bad thing? No, you need to split Fayetteville. But to split Fayetteville into Districts 45, District 44, District 43, and District 42 only really leads to one conclusion.
And just so it's absolutely clear, focusing your attention on the map on the right-hand side of the screen that shows the splits of Fayetteville that you're talking about, could you just, for the record, what color is Fayetteville in this particular map that
It's
you're looking
sort of a Seahawk, kind of a light blue, I guess, is Fayetteville, I would call it. You can also see Hope Mills right down there, split amongst multiple districts as well. That's more of a vanilla color, I'll call it.
All right, let's move on to another cluster. We pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 307, which is on page 78 of your report.
Okay.
So, Dr. Cooper, I think that we saw a version of this map that was actually the legend for all of the maps that you're now talking about. But could you tell us what we're looking at here and how it relates to your analysis of the partisan impacts and partisan intent in this case?
Yes, I can. And this is the indeed the map that we saw with the legend, so it should look somewhat familiar. So we've got Anston and Union counties. You can see the county split in the middle. And I think everybody's attention is probably focused on the same place that mine is, which is this bright blue dot at Monroe and the split right through the middle of it. So what does that do? That splits or cracks these Democratic voters, and it puts them in two different districts. Which districts does it put them with? It puts them with two different districts that are composed overwhelmingly of Republican voters and Republican VTDs, thus ensuring that those Democratic voters that are being split in Monroe, instead of having voting power together, are going to be split across 68, 69, reducing the probability that they are able to be represented by a Democrat anytime in the near future.
Let's pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 308. Dr. Cooper, we're looking, it appears to be a map of the same districts, but showing municipalities this time. Could you tell us, take us through what we're looking at here in this map?
So this is, again, one of these municipality split maps, and you can see the Monroe split very clearly. This isn't just a function of the labeling or something, right, that we saw in the previous map. These are actual splits. You can also see the split of Mineral Springs. You can see the split of Waxhaw pretty clearly. You can see there's even Unionville has a small split, although probably not a significant one. And you can see another split right at Wingate, although again, that one's not very big.
And Monroe, in this map that we're looking at, is the sort of the pinkish color towards the center of the map?
That's right. So it's pink here, and remember, those were the bright blue VTDs in the previous map.
And the pink showing us the municipality of Monroe looks from this map here that it's split into all 3 House districts.
That's right. So the cracking of the blue VTDs we saw before was apparent in 68 and 69, but the actual municipality of Monroe is split between 68, 69, and 55.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 309, which is on page 80 of your report. And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in this map?
Okay, so this is, we've seen some like this before. Don't pay any attention to the colors as being meaningful by themselves. They're just illustrating different districts. So this is 68, 69, and 55. And this is, again, just to give you a sense of kind of how this feels for a voter, how this feels for a citizen of North Carolina. So if I had taken the back way here on Highway 74 from my house, I'd be coming from the west to the east. I would be in District 69. I would then be on the border between 68 and 69. The court reporter is about to get mad at me for this part. I'm then going to be in 68. I'm then back in 69. I'm then on the border between 68 and 69. I'm back in 69. I'm on the border between 69 and 55. I'm back in 69, and we're all cleared out in 55.
I think I'm still with you, Doc.
Yeah, and this is, just to give you a sense, I guess 2 more things. You can see the key up here. This is not like over 200 miles or over some huge expanse of land or geography. This is also not a mountain road that's, dragging way left and way right. This is a fairly straight road over a very small geographic area.
And could we just pull back up Plaintiff's Exhibit 307 so we can see the partisan impact of what you're describing here on the screen? Dr. Cooper, are you familiar with what the election results for these 3 House districts have been since the last redistricting cycle?
So these were all won by Republican candidates in 2018.
And do you happen to recall what the election results were in elections before 2018?
I don't, off the top of my head.
Okay.
So,
Would it surprise you to learn that Republicans have won all 3 districts in all 3 election cycles since 2011?
it would not. It would surprise me if I learned that were not true, but I did not recall that, so I'm sure that is true.
Let's move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 310, which is on page 81 of your expert report.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked quite a bit about this particular House-County cluster earlier in the day. But can you tell us what we're looking at in this map here?
Sure. This is House Districts 58, 59, and 60 in Guilford County.
And this map doesn't show all of the House districts in this particular county cluster, is that right?
That's correct.
What House districts does this map show?
Just 59, 58, and 60. In other words, the ones that were not redrawn by the special master.
And tell us about how this map supports your conclusions that you've already testified to.
Sure. So I talked about the sort of backwards C shape that we seem to see a lot. And I think you see that, hopefully, presented very clearly here. And so we're starting on the northern part. We're then coming south. We're then going west. And I understand, and I think I understood the testimony earlier today to be talking about parts of this that couldn't have been changed based on what the special master did, right? So some of these borders were locked into place. But all of these borders certainly were not locked into place. So I think if we look at essentially everything, again, pardon my really quite embarrassing drawing, there, I think you can see this is all area that was not drawn by the special master. I'm going to clear that off so as to not embarrass myself too much. But you can see 59 is clearly drawn. It would be difficult for me to imagine that this is not drawn with partisan intent. You can see these boot-like appendages that come down from 58. And then, of course, you can see the way 60 is drawn as well.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 311 on page 83 of your report. Dr. Cooper, can you tell us about your analysis of the two House districts in this county?
Sure. So this is House District 63 and 64. This is Alamance County. I guess I draw your attention to a few things here. One, I would draw your attention to, I guess most importantly, this, I don't know, like lizard's head or duck's head or something that seems to be where the Burlington area is. And kind of remind everybody, well, one, you can see a clear cracking of these Democratic voters across multiple districts, right? So to make sure that those voters don't have as much voting power together, some are in 63, some are in 64. I would also add that, yes, it's a split, and perhaps there were reasons to make that split. But I would ask you just to look at the shape of that split and just think through, are there other plausible explanations for why it would be drawn in this manner, as well as connecting this to how is a voter going to feel when they're trying to understand their political process. And it's not just that there's a big line going right through the middle of their city. It's it's an oddly shaped district that doesn't seem to be drawn for any other reason, and again, has clear partisan consequences for one party, namely the Republican Party, to benefit, and the other party, namely the Democratic Party, not to.
So you're talking about this split of Burlington. Can we do as a split screen, actually, the exhibit we're looking at alongside Plaintiff's Exhibit 312? And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at on the right side of the screen, Plaintiff's Exhibit 312?
So this is, again, one of these municipality maps, so don't pay attention to the colors other than to identify the specific places. And you can see Burlington very clearly, and you can see how these districts cut across Burlington.
And for the record, what color is Burlington on the right side of the screen?
I'm going to call it teal. Can we agree on teal?
I think maybe closer to green. But
Yeah, green. All right, maybe Mevin's more teal. I don't know. I'm bad with my colors. My wife will attest. Sort of a green.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 313, which is on page 85 of your report. I think we talked about this duck's head
Yeah.
a little while ago, but can you explain to us what this is here?
Sure. So this is, again, the idea is just to give everyone in the room a sense of what this feels like for voters, and just to zoom in on a specific part of the district. And so, again, I'll draw your attention to the key here. You can see 4 miles. This is not a long stretch of road, so this isn't like you've got to, take some huge leap. And you can see that if you're going from west to east on US Highway 70, you're going to be in District 64, on the border between 64 and 63, back in 64, back in 63. We're now on the border between, let's see here, 63 and 64. We're back in 64. We're then crossing back over to 63, and then we're crossing back over into 64.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 314, which is on page 86 of your expert report. And so, Dr. Cooper, can you talk to us about the House districts in this county cluster?
Sure. So this is House District 66, 67, 76, 77, 82, and 83. And so, again, you're a map maker. You're looking at these, some sort of a coding like this. How do you maximize partisan advantage for one party and not for the other? One answer is you split municipalities, but again, in critical ways. So if you look at where Kannapolis is split, if you look at where Concord is split, if you make sure that the Democratic voters in Salisbury, up at the top of 76, are combined with some of the most Republican voters in Albemarle, right? You put all this together, and what you've created is a gerrymandered map that benefits one party at the expense of the other.
Just to get a better sense of what you're describing, can we do as a split screen the exhibit we're looking at alongside Plaintiff's Exhibit 315, which is on page 88 of your expert report? So Dr. Cooper, this looks to be another one of those municipality split maps, but can you describe what we're looking at here?
Sure. So I pointed out before the split at Concord, so that's green. I'll call that one green. You can see Kannapolis is a purple, and you can see Kannapolis that's split across districts. You can see, remember that blue dot at Salisbury? You can see there's a small split in Salisbury. I'm less concerned about that than I am Salisbury and those Democratic voters being combined with the most Republican VTD south of there. So you can see a series of splits, again, some of which maybe needed to happen, many of which did not.
Let's move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 316, which is on page 89 of your report. Dr. Cooper, could you talk to us about what you see when you look at the boundaries of the House districts in this particular county cluster?
Sure. So this is Yadkin and Forsyth counties. This is, of course, centered around Winston-Salem. And again, here, you're a map maker, you're drawing lines, you're trying to benefit one party instead of the other. You've got to find a way to deal with this problem of Winston-Salem. But try to move the needle as much as possible for one party, the Republican Party in this case, instead of the other party, the Democratic Party in that case. And so you can see, of course, we've got to have a county traversal here. That's not a problem. But the way 73 comes in, grabs some of these Democratic voters from Winston-Salem. You can see 75 makes its way. I'm not sure how big that passageway is right here, but I bet it's not very large. And so you're connecting all of those Republican voters there, and then you're leaving 71 packed with Democrats, 72 packed with Democrats.
Let's take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 317 on page 90 of your expert report. I think you were describing the split of Winston-Salem a
Yes.
moment ago, but could you talk to us about what we're looking at in this map?
Sure. So again, Winston-Salem is too big to constitute a single district, certainly. But here we see that Winston-Salem is split in 75, 71, 72, and 74. Right. So I forgot, and 73 as well. So Winston-Salem literally appears in every district in this cluster.
All 5 districts.
That's correct.
Just so the record's clear, Winston-Salem is the purple color. That we're
Yes, it is the purple color. Sorry.
Let's take another look, another perspective on the splits of Winston-Salem. Can we take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 318, which is on page 91 of your expert report? Dr. Cooper, tell us about what we're looking at here.
Sure. This is, again, not the whole cluster. It's not even all of Forsyth County. We're just looking at the Winston-Salem city limits. And you can see House Districts 71 and 72 packed in with Democrats, right? There's 2 red VTDs. Excuse me. And then you can see House Districts 73, 74, and 75, right? So here we've got much more heterogeneous mix of counties. So what is the goal here? To pack Democratic voters into as few districts as possible, freeing up the surrounding places to be much more competitive for the Republicans.
All right, let's move on to Mecklenburg County. Can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 319, which is page 92 of your expert report?
Okay.
And Dr. Cooper, tell us what we're looking at in this map.
Sure. This is Mecklenburg County, the most populous county in North Carolina. And this is, I won't list them all, but the House districts there. And in general, the geography of this place should be similar, right? We saw something kind of similar in the Senate before, so I won't belabor the point too long. But you can see, for example, 92, so I'm on the west side now, 92, 88, 101, completely packed with not a single Republican VTD there. You can look at 106 and see something similar. You can look at 99. I'm just kind of moving my way around. You can look at 100 and see something similar. You look at 102 and see something similar. So obviously there are geographic voting patterns that exist. The key is connecting those together in such a way that one party consistently benefits at the expense of the other. You can then see the sort of like the pizza slice that we talked about before in 104, connecting these areas and then making sure that 105 stays as competitive as possible for Republicans. Same with 103 and of course with 98.
And again, we can see the district boundaries, particularly of House District 104, sort of on the southwestern side and even the northwestern part of it, with quite precision, some precision moving around the VTDs there. Does that allow you to infer anything about intent here?
Sure. Again, I think all of this has to be taken in context. I think looking at any of these maps individually, you can have questions. I think looking at this in context with all the other maps we've seen and all the other decisions that were made, I think you can see pretty clearly that there was intent to benefit one party at the expense of the other. Choices may be somewhat constrained in some cases, but when there are choices to be made here, they benefited one party at the expense of the other.
You've mentioned this pizza slice, this red pizza slice a couple times. Just to get another view of that, can we look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 320, which is on page 93 of your expert report? And can you just describe what this is for us, Dr. Cooper?
Sure. So this is, again, a city map, a city limits map, not all of MEC, just the city limits of Charlotte. And you can see, and I won't read them all to you, but all those districts on the left, look all day long, you're not going to find a red VTD there. But this pizza slice, again, that starts at the southernmost point here of the city and then juts into the middle of the city to create one district that is as competitive as possible for the Republicans. I think is also a good illustration of why you don't just look at the overall number of Democratic versus Republican victories in some cluster. The key is how are we moving the scale consistently for one party?
All right, let's move on to another House District cluster. Can we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 323, which is on page 96 of your report? Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at here?
Here we're looking at a county cluster with House Districts 108, 109, 110, and 111. And here I think what we see pretty clearly, right, you see the split of Shelby. And again, why is Shelby important? Shelby's important because it's a Democratic voting block. So we're cracking that Democratic voting block across multiple districts, across 111 and across 110. You can also see the same thing happens in Gastonia. So this is another good example of the choices that are made. There's only a few pockets of Democratic voters. So what does the map maker do? The map maker chooses to crack those Democratic voters across as many districts as possible.
And let's pull up as a split screen, if we can, Plaintiff's Exhibit 325 on the right side. And this is showing us another view of some of the municipalities that you're testifying about being split by these districts. But can you describe what we're looking at there?
Sure. So this is, again, it's just a map of the boundaries. Colors by themselves don't mean that much. And I'm sure we'll fight in a second over what these colors are. But Shelby, which I'm going to call green, I'm going to offer that as green.
I agree with you there.
is pretty clearly split between 111 and 110. I think you can see Gastonia, which I'm going to offer as gold, is split between 109, 108, and 110. And I think those are the two to pay the most attention to here. There's some other minor splits, Kings Mountain and the like, but the Gastonia and the Shelby are the two that have the partisan consequences.
So again, this looks like another example of where we see municipality splits. The splits are along lines that have a very specific partisan implication.
That's right. They have partisan effect.
Let's take a look at another House County cluster. If we could move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 326 on page 99. And we are back home for you.
Yeah,
Could you tell us what we're looking at here in this map?
sure. So this is Western North Carolina. You are looking at Buncombe County, and everybody's eyes are probably drawn to the big blue dot that is the city of Asheville. And you can see here, not only packing these Democrats in 114 together, but then separating these Democratic voters to the east, placing them only with some in the north, and combining them with these Republican voters in the north and in the south, right? So you're packing in 114, you're then making 116 and 115 more competitive for the other party.
And you had talked about some university splits, college campus splits, with some of the other House County clusters, but let's look at the one here. Could we pull up Plaintiff Exhibit 328, which is on page 101 of your report?
Right.
And Dr. Cooper, could you tell us what we're looking at in this map?
Sure. So we've been looking at some larger campuses, many of which are in kind of larger cities. This is actually a split of Warren Wilson College, right? So if you know about Warren Wilson, you probably don't think of it as a conservative mecca, I'm guessing. I think it's probably fair to say. And so you can, it's also a very small campus. And you can see the split that runs through Warren Wilson Road. And again, I think this is not just like a footnote factoid. I think this is important as we try to understand representation. And the reason I say that is that the mailboxes the students receive their mail in is in one district, and the actual dorms are in a different district. So you're trying to educate students, you're trying to tell them about politics, you're trying to tell them that they should vote, and then you have to describe to them why their mailbox is in one district and their house is in another.
So, Dr. Cooper, we've talked about a number of Senate county clusters and House district clusters, and your analysis of those. I'd like to move on to the next question you considered regarding the map files from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive that you reviewed. And what map files from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive did you review?
So I reviewed, let's see here, I think 2 Microsoft Word files, maybe 1 Excel file, and then the main part was I reviewed maptitude for redistricting files from 2011 and 2017, both for the House and the Senate. So 4 maps essentially, and a few other ancillary files.
And the map files you viewed and you performed analysis of, the file path for those was contained within your expert report, one of your expert reports in this case?
That's correct, the second expert report.
The expert report that you submitted in June of this year?
That's correct.
Okay.
Your Honors, I'll just note for the record our standing objection to the testimony and admission of the Hoffler files, and we'll rely upon our previous arguments. We understand the court's ruling on those issues.
Thank you. Same objection from the interveners.
All right, and the objections are overruled.
Now you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cooper, how did you actually receive the map files from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive in order for you to analyze them?
So they came from the plaintiff's counsel's forensic vendor. So this is Stroh's Freeburg, I believe was the name. So they come as a file. They are almost looks like a zip file in some ways. That is then taken unencrypted and opened up. And I did not have, do not and did not have access to a license for maptitude for redistricting. So again, I relied on Mr. Esselstyn to open those files for me. I will note that he opened them in my presence. I have the benefit of geography. So just to give you a sense of kind of how that worked, I actually went to his office. He would download, unencrypt, and open with me literally and perhaps uncomfortably for him standing over his shoulder. Mr. Esselstyn has a stand-up desk instead of a sitting desk, so I'm literally standing to his left as he's unencrypting and opening these files.
And once you had opened the Maptitude files from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive with Mr. Esselston standing there next to him, were you able to tell what you were looking at?
I was.
We take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 330, and this is actually on page 5 of your June expert report. So Dr. Cooper, can you tell us what we're looking at here in Exhibit 330?
Sure. This is the partisan formula field for 2017 NC Senate redistricting from his hard drive, from
And this
Dr.
is-
Hoffler's hard drive. It's a screenshot of that, I should have said.
So this is what you were actually able to personally observe as you were standing there viewing the map file?
This is.
Okay. And did you do anything to alter the map file before capturing the screenshot that we're looking at here?
I did not.
And is the screenshot that we're looking at a fair and accurate depiction of what you were able to personally observe?
It is.
So you mentioned a moment ago that there's a partisan formula that's visible here.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what that is.
So I will, and I'll say on the front end, Dr. Hoffler had a Microsoft Word file that lays out what each of these things stands for. So most of them are fairly self-explanatory, but if they're not, and those are also contained in my second expert report. So this is a partisan formula field. You can see somewhere there's a little line. You can see kind of a fraction, right? So the denominator of the fraction is the total vote across all these elections, right? Total two-party vote across these elections. So the Republican candidate plus the Democratic candidate. And then the top, or the numerator of this, is just Republican vote share. So taken all together, what is this? It's the average Republican vote share by VTD for a series of elections.
And what elections are included in this formula that we can see?
Right, so there's the presidential election is certainly included. There's a number of Senate elections. There are some, but not all, Council of State elections. There's also the governor's election. And you can see where he says DV, that's Democratic vote. You can see where he says RV, that's Republican vote. And the rest of the code is again contained in this Microsoft Word file.
And these are the same elections, and this is the same partisan formula that Dr. Chen was describing earlier in his testimony in this case.
It is.
Okay. And it includes elections from 2008 to 2014.
That's right. I should have said that. So if you see, it says 08, it's from 2008. If it says 12, it's from 2012. If it says 10, 2010. If it says 14, it's from 2014.
We can also see in Exhibit 330 this screenshot of the Maptitude file from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive. We can see a color coding, sort of a key with different colors on the left-hand side of the exhibit.
That's correct.
What is that, Dr. Cooper?
So that is the kind of visual representation of that formula. Okay, so and I know we're used to blue meaning Democrat and red meaning Republican. This doesn't work quite that way, although some later will. So you can see the most Democratic VTD is actually the red and the pink at the top. So the pink is 0 to 35% Republican. The red is 35 to 40% Republican, and on. So then you've got the yellow in the middle and the green at the highest levels of Republican. And so you can see in the background that field sort of sitting there. And I don't know, I like to think of this sort of like a traffic light. Like if you are a Republican map maker, you're trying to draw a map to benefit one party at the expense of the other. The red is sort of saying stop, the green is saying go, and the yellow is saying stop and consider.
So this is like a traffic light. Red means stop, but in this case it also means Democratic voters.
That's correct.
Okay. We're going to look at some more maps with this color coding in a second.
Okay.
But just to sort of tie this together with what you were talking about earlier, just as you were applying a color code to the partisanship of the different district maps we looked at in your original expert report, Dr. Hoffler here, as you saw from these map files, is applying a color code to describe the partisanship of the VTDs in the districts he's drawing?
Yes, it's very similar. The color coding's obviously different. Some of the bins are different, but it's very similar, and I think when we walk through some of the specific maps, they'll look familiar to you. You'll see some of the same places represented in some very similar ways.
So we're going to come to some of those maps, but I want to ask you first, did you also look at any metadata for the particular file that we can see in this screenshot?
Yes.
All right, could we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 565? And Dr. Cooper, what are we looking at in Plaintiff's Exhibit 565?
So this is, it's the properties file, so it's not difficult to get there. If I remember correctly, see, I guess you see at the top of the screen, you've got File, Edit, Map, Data View, just like you would in anything else, these menus. You've got your shortcuts. And then if you click Redistricting and you click through, you can get to Plan Settings and you can get to Properties, and that's what we're seeing here. And so you can see this is a State Senate map from his NC Senate J24. You can see the administrator initials there, standing for Dr. Hoffler. You can see the date created, in this case, June 24th, 2017. You can see the date last modified, in this case, July 2nd, 2017. And he used military time, as you can see here as well. And Dr. Chin covered in great detail with the comments box before the lineage of the file, so I'll save us that explanation.
And just so it's absolutely clear, the name of the map file that we're looking at here, can you tell what that is from what you're looking at in the properties window?
Yes, this is the North Carolina Senate J24.
Okay. And this screenshot, which is of the properties window for this particular map file, NC Senate J24, is this something you personally observed as you opened up the map file from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive?
It is.
And is this a fair and accurate depiction of what you were able to personally observe?
It is.
And did you do anything to alter the map file before you captured this screenshot?
I did not.
I'm going to ask you about a number of other screenshots from the Maptitude files that were obtained from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive. And for any of those screenshots that you took of his map files, did you do anything to alter the map files before capturing the screenshots?
I did not.
And are these all screenshots of Maptitude files that you were able to personally observe when you opened them?
Yes.
So let's go back to Plaintiff's Exhibit 330. And this was the screenshot showing us Dr. Hoffler's partisan formula and the color coding, the traffic light that you talked about a moment ago. Was this partisan formula field, or was a partisan formula included in any of the other Maptitude files that you viewed from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive?
Yes.
Okay, and how many of them was there a partisan formula field?
All of them.
And was there a similar color coding that corresponded to that partisan formula field in the other files you viewed from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive?
There was, as we'll see the specifics of the color coding changes, but there was a color-coded partisan field at the VTD level available in every one of these.
So I'm going to show you some particular screenshots, additional screenshots in a moment, but based on what you were able to view, including this partisan formula and the color coding that's in front of us here in this particular exhibit, were you able to come to any conclusion about the use of partisanship data in the design of the North Carolina state legislative maps?
Sure. Together, this tells me that the primary architect of our maps in North Carolina had access to partisan data, had a partisan data live and active, and was clearly working with partisan data on the same maps at the same time that he's drawing lines for our state.
And that chief architect that you referred to is Dr. Thomas Hoffler.
That's correct.
Your Honors, I would just object to that because I don't believe he's laid the foundation to say that Dr. Hoffler had this available as he was actually drawing the district lines or anything of that nature. I think he's made a generalization based upon the availability of the data, so we would object to that characterization.
All right, again, we're going to accept his opinion about what his expert opinion about what the data shows to him. We recognize that ultimately this may be an issue of fact for the finders of fact to determine, but we are going to accept the testimony of the conclusions that he draws as an expert from what he has viewed from this data. So the objection is overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cooper, going back to when you actually opened up these Maptitude for Redistricting files and viewed them, is it your understanding that whatever is last visible on the screen is what is last saved in those Maptitude for Redistricting files?
Yes, that's correct. And I probably should have said a second ago, when these first come up, it's a map of the state, but you don't see the whole state at one time, right? You see a portion of a state, it's on one screen. And so essentially the placement is what saves when you close down. So where on the state he was looking.
And how about this color coding for partisanship that we've been talking about? Is that visible on the screen?
Yes.
So that was visible on the screen when you first opened up the Maptitude for Redistricting files that you viewed,
That's correct.
indicating that that's when it was last saved, that partisan color coding was active.
That's right. So in this case, I don't remember the date, but whatever the date last saved was, that's what was available and on.
So let's go to another one of these screenshots. Could we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 332? This is on page 8 of your June expert report.
Sorry.
And we see this traffic light color coding again. I'll let you get to it, Dr. Chris.
Sorry about that. Just a second. Yeah. Trying to find my other expert report.
Should be Plaintiff Exhibit 332, but page 8 of, I believe
Got it.
it's Plaintiff's Exhibit 329 is your June expert report. in this
Gotcha.
case.
Okay, sorry.
So as we're looking at this screenshot, can you tell us what this is, Dr. Cooper?
Sure. So this is Senate Districts 10, 11, and 12. Okay. So this is the Rocky Mount piece that we talked about previously, and it's a little harder to see in this one, just the way the colors look on the screen, or at least it's harder for me to see. But you can see, if you look, you can find Rocky Mount on this, and you can see that the map looks very similar. Again, different colors than the ones we use, but it looks very, very similar to the partisan maps that we were looking at before for this cluster. You can also see the key clearly available on the left side. So again, what does this tell us? This tells us, at a very minimum, that when Dr. Hoffler saved this file, he had partisan data to the VTD level available, and that tracks very well with the partisan data that we saw in my report before.
We're going to go ahead and recess at this time and resume at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Superior Court stands in recess until tomorrow at 9 o'clock.